She turned down every man in town, except the one man who never asked. For 7 years, Evelyn Harper said no to ranchers, merchants, and men of fortune, and the town of Black Ridge Crossing couldn't figure out why. Then Gideon Barrett, the most powerful cattle baron in 3 counties, set his sights on her. And suddenly, time was no longer on anyone's side. But this isn't a story about the richest man winning. This is the story of what happens when a good man waits too long, a strong woman runs out of patience, and one honest conversation changes the entire course of 2 lives forever. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, and let's begin. The trouble with Evelyn Harper wasn't that she was difficult. The trouble was that she was reasonable. And reasonable women in 1884 were not supposed to turn down good offers the way she did. She wasn't cold about it either. That would have been easier for everyone to understand. Cold women had reasons people could point to. A broken heart somewhere in their past. A bitter mother who'd soured them on marriage. Some tragedy that left them sealed up tight as a mason jar. The town could have lived with that. People understood damage. But Evelyn wasn't damaged. She smiled at church socials. She brought soup to sick neighbors without being asked. She laughed at the right moments and listened during the wrong ones, the kind of listening that made a person feel like the only soul in a crowded room. She was by every measurable standard a woman who wanted a life, a full one, with a partner, a household, children eventually. She'd never hidden that. She just kept saying no. And nobody in Black Ridge Crossing could quite work out why. The town itself sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridgelines in the Wyoming Territory, the kind of place that had grown up fast and practical, without much thought given to beauty. Main Street was 3 blocks of packed dirt and wooden storefronts. There was a post office, a general store run by the Whitfield family, a church with a bell that stuck in cold weather, 2 saloons, and a livery stable at the eastern end of the street that had been operating under the name Mercer and Son since 1871. Though the son in the sign now referred to the man who'd inherited it, not the one who'd built it. The surrounding land was cattle country mostly, a handful of ranches spread out like fingers from the town center, some of them running thousands of head across grazing territory that stretched to the horizon. The winters hit hard and stayed long. The summers were short and brilliant, and over before you remembered to appreciate them. People in Black Ridge Crossing had a particular relationship with time. They didn't waste it because the land wouldn't allow it, which made Evelyn Harper's situation all the more puzzling to her neighbors. She was 28 years old. In this town, in this year, that number meant something. Not something cruel, necessarily. Nobody was unkind about it, at least not to her face, but it meant the window that everyone assumed existed for a woman like her was narrowing, and the whole community watched that window the way farmers watched the sky before a storm, with a kind of collective, helpless attention. Her father, Douglas Harper, had died 3 years prior and left her the farmstead, 40 acres, a decent house, a small vegetable operation that she'd expanded thoughtfully, and enough livestock to keep her solvent if she was careful. She was careful. She was always careful. That was the thing about Evelyn that people sometimes mistook for coldness, her deliberateness. She didn't rush. She didn't react. She considered, and then she acted, and by the time she moved on something, she'd already made peace with whatever it cost her. That quality made her an excellent farmer. It made her a slightly maddening neighbor. And it had, over the course of 7 years, made her the subject of more dinner table speculation than any woman in the valley deserved. The proposals had started when she was 21. The first came from Carl Braddock, who ran 200 head on the north side of the valley and had a perfectly acceptable face and a reputation for paying his hands on time. He'd asked her father's permission first, which Douglas had given cautiously, not wanting to assume for his daughter. Evelyn had listened to Carl's offer. It was a formal thing, done in the parlor, with Douglas sitting in the corner pretending to read, and she'd thanked him sincerely and told him no. Carl had asked why. "Because I don't love you," she'd said. Not unkindly, just plainly, the way she said most things. Carl had stood there for a moment, recalibrating, because nobody had given him that reason before. Most women in Black Ridge Crossing who turned down a man at least offered something softer. "I'm not ready yet," or "My father needs me here," or "You deserve someone who suits you better." Evelyn had just told him the truth. and it had landed like a dropped wrench on a hardwood floor. He'd married someone else within the year. They seemed fine. The second proposal came from James Whitfield, the general store owner's eldest son, who was educated and mannered and had a future in commerce that everyone agreed was promising. He'd courted her for 3 months first, which showed more patience than Carl had managed. By the end of those 3 months, Evelyn had concluded that James was a genuinely good person who wanted a woman to admire from a comfortable distance, and that what she wanted was not that. She told him no. The third was a rancher named Pete Dalton, who'd ridden in from Laramie and heard about her through some mutual connection and arrived at her door one Sunday afternoon like a man who'd been given directions to a destination he hadn't verified himself. He was confident, broad-shouldered, and had the specific kind of charm that only worked on people who hadn't seen it before. Evelyn had seen it before. She'd fed him lunch, which he seemed to take as a promising sign, and then she'd told him she wasn't interested. And he'd ridden back to Laramie looking considerably less confident than he'd arrived. After that, the proposals slowed. Not stopped. There were 2 more, minor ones, men who'd half convinced themselves it was worth trying. But the volume dropped because the town had arrived at a consensus. Evelyn Harper was waiting for something, and nobody knew what it was. The leading theory, held by most of the women and all of the more romantically inclined men, was that she was waiting for someone from the East, some educated, prosperous man who would arrive by stage and recognize in her something the local men had missed. This theory was popular because it was flattering to Evelyn while also explaining why she'd passed on perfectly adequate local options. The second theory, held mostly by the more practical-minded residents, was that she didn't want to marry at all, that she was content on her own land, running her own life, and the whole business of a husband struck her as more trouble than the benefits warranted. This theory had some merit and was treated with quiet respect by some and quiet disapproval by others, depending on who you asked. The third theory was held by exactly one person in Black Ridge Crossing, and that person was Ruth Caffey, who ran the seamstress shop on the south end of Main Street, and who had been Evelyn's closest friend since they were both 12 years old. Ruth's theory was not complicated. Evelyn was waiting for Silas Mercer, had been waiting for Silas Mercer, and would likely keep waiting for Silas Mercer until either he said something or she gave up entirely. Ruth kept this theory mostly to herself, because she was discreet when it mattered, but she held it with the specific, unshakable certainty of someone who had seen the evidence firsthand and drawn the only logical conclusion available. Silas Mercer was 31 years old and had been running the livery stable since he was 19, when his father's health had made the handoff necessary and somewhat abrupt. He was not, by the town's conventional accounting, a remarkable man. He wasn't wealthy. The stable did well enough, covered its expenses, gave him a decent living, but there was no fortune being built there, no land expanding under his ownership. He wasn't particularly educated. He'd had basic schooling, could read and write well enough, and had supplemented what he knew through years of practical work and whatever books he could get his hands on. But he wasn't the kind of man who quoted philosophy at dinner parties. He was quiet. Not the suspicious kind of quiet, not the wounded kind, just the natural, unhurried silence of a man who'd spent most of his adult life working alongside horses, who had learned to communicate without much noise, who listened more than he spoke and meant what he said when he said it. He was tall, built solidly from years of physical work, not in a showy way, but in the functional way of a man whose body had been shaped by what his hands had to do. He had an honest face, the kind that aged slowly and showed its feelings more than he probably realized. His hands were always clean as he could get them, which was never entirely clean because stable work left its marks regardless of how careful you were. He'd known Evelyn Harper for most of his life. Their fathers had been acquaintances, not close friends, but the kind of men who respected each other, who spoke at town meetings, who'd traded favors a few times over the years. Silas and Evelyn had grown up in the same small orbit without growing up particularly close, the way children in small towns sometimes share a world without quite sharing a history. It was after Douglas Harper died that things shifted, though shifted was perhaps too active a word for what had happened, which was more like a slow geological change that neither of them had a name for while it was happening. Evelyn had needed help that first winter. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of help that a woman alone on 40 acres in Wyoming in February genuinely needed, with a fence section down and livestock that needed a farrier and a barn door that had warped beyond her ability to fix it herself. She'd hired Silas. He'd done the work without making her feel like she was asking too much. He'd come back when she called, and after a while she stopped thinking of it as hiring and started thinking of it as simply how things were. They had a rhythm now, 3 years later, that the town observed without fully understanding. He came out to the Harper place once or twice a week, sometimes for work, sometimes not, sometimes just to sit on the porch for 20 minutes before heading back. She stopped by the stable when she was in town, brought him coffee she'd kept warm wrapped in a cloth, stood in the doorway watching him work in the way that people only watch things they find genuinely interesting. They talked. They talked about practical things, mostly. The horses, the land, the weather that was always either threatening or recovering from having threatened. They talked about books occasionally, since it turned out they'd read some of the same ones through different routes. They talked about the town, though neither of them was much for gossip. They talked in the comfortable, unhurried way of people who aren't trying to impress each other, which is the rarest kind of talking there is. What they did not talk about was what any of it meant. Silas, for his part, had not allowed himself to think clearly about what it meant, because thinking clearly about it required him to arrive at a conclusion that seemed on its face absurd. That a woman like Evelyn Harper, capable, admired, pursued, a woman who could have had Carl Braddock's 200 head or James Whitfield's commercial future or any number of other solid, respectable arrangements, might look at a man who ran a livery stable and feel something other than practical appreciation. He knew what he felt. He'd known for a long time, with the kind of knowing that lives in the chest rather than the head, the kind you can't talk yourself out of no matter how sensible you try to be. He just never once considered that it might be mutual, because the idea seemed like the kind of presumption that could embarrass a man permanently, and Blackridge Crossing was a small enough place that there was nowhere to go after an embarrassment like that. So he said nothing, and she said nothing, and the town watched them not saying anything and mostly drew the wrong conclusions. Ruth Caffey drew the right one, and waited with diminishing patience for someone to do something about it. The morning Gideon Barrett rode into town for what everyone understood was serious business, the air was already thick with July heat, the kind that pressed down on the valley and made the horses irritable and the dogs too lethargic to bark. Gideon Barrett was not a subtle man, but he was a smart one, which is a combination that tends to get things done. He was 53, twice widowed, and ran the largest cattle operation in the territory, the Double B, which sprawled across 20,000 acres east of Blackridge Crossing and employed enough hands to constitute its own small community. He had the look of a man who'd built something real with real work before the money came in heavy enough to let him stop doing it himself. He was thick across the shoulders still, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had settled into an expression of permanent, patient calculation. He'd known Evelyn Harper by reputation before he'd known her by name. He'd heard about her from Thomas Aldridge, who'd heard about her from 2 separate men who'd ridden in his cattle drives. The description he'd received was simple enough. Smart woman, keeps her own place in good order, turned down every reasonable offer in 3 counties. Gideon had found that last part interesting rather than discouraging. A woman with standards was a woman with sense, and sense was something he valued considerably more than compliance. He'd introduced himself to her at the spring social in April, which was a public enough setting that it carried no particular implication, just 2 people talking at the edges of a crowded room. He'd been straightforward about his interest. He wasn't the type for prolonged games. He'd said he'd like to call on her, if she was willing to allow it. She'd said she'd think about it, which was not a yes, but was notably not the immediate no she'd given other men. And he'd taken that as enough to proceed. He'd called on her twice in May, once in June. He'd brought practical gifts to a book she'd mentioned wanting, a good quality bridle for her mare, things chosen with enough specificity to prove he'd been listening. He'd been honest about what he was offering, a partnership, essentially, a consolidation of her good sense and management skill with his resources and operation. He hadn't dressed it up as something it wasn't. He wasn't looking for romance, exactly. He was past the age where romance seemed like the primary thing. But he respected her, and he thought that was worth more at this stage of life than most people gave it credit for. Evelyn had listened to all of it with the same careful attention she gave everything. She hadn't said yes. She hadn't said no. She'd asked questions, practical ones, about how the Double B operated, about what he expected from a wife in terms of involvement, about the children from his first marriage who were grown and scattered. He'd answered everything without hedging, which she appreciated. but she hadn't said yes. And now it was July, and Gideon Barrett was riding into Blackridge Crossing with Randall Priest, his estate lawyer, which meant the formal stage was approaching whether anyone was ready for it or not. The news reached Main Street before Gideon did, the way news always moved in small towns. Ahead of itself, carried on some current that had nothing to do with physical speed. Mabel Trent saw Randall Priest's distinctive black coat from the window of the post office and told Agnes Whitfield, who told her husband, who was restocking shelves with his son James at the time, which made that particular telling somewhat awkward. James Whitfield absorbed the information with the controlled expression of a man who'd learned not to let his feelings show, finished restocking the shelves, and said nothing about it for the rest of the afternoon. Ruth Caffey heard the news from a woman picking up mended curtains and set down her needle immediately and said, "Oh, damn," with feeling, which was uncharacteristic enough that the curtain woman asked if everything was all right. "Just a pattern that's not going to work," Ruth said, which was true in at least two senses. At the stable, Silas was working on a shoe for a gray gelding that belonged to one of the outlying farms when Tommy Hatch came in. Tommy was 14, the blacksmith's son, and a dedicated carrier of information, and told him about Gideon Barrett and Randall Priest riding in together. Silas kept working. "Everybody's saying he's going to make it formal," Tommy said. He had the slightly breathless quality of someone delivering news they find personally exciting. "An official proposal, proper-like, with legal papers and everything." "That right," Silas said. "Not a question. Miss Harper's the only one he's been calling on. Everybody knows it." Tommy paused, as if giving Silas an opportunity to react. "What do you think about that?" Silas looked up from the hoof he was holding. He looked at Tommy with the expression of a man who has had a great deal of practice at not showing what he's thinking. "I think that gelding's shoe needed replacing 2 weeks ago," he said. "I think whoever's been riding him on rocky ground needs to slow down. And I think you've got chores your father probably wants done." Tommy took the hint and left. Silas set down the hoof carefully, straightened, and stood for a moment in the dim, hay-scented interior of the stable, with the gelding breathing beside him and the sound of Main Street coming in through the open door. And he thought about nothing in particular with the intensity of a man thinking about something very specific indeed. Evelyn was at her place when the news reached her, brought by her neighbor Clara Finch, who arrived on foot with the particular energy of a woman delivering urgent information. "Gideon Barrett's in town," Clara said, catching her breath at the gate. "With his lawyer, Randall Priest, the one from Cheyenne." Evelyn was pulling weeds from the kitchen garden. She sat back on her heels and looked at Clara with an expression that gave nothing away. "I know who Randall Priest is," she said. "Well?" Clara gestured vaguely in the direction of town, as if the gesture completed the sentence. Evelyn stood, brushed the dirt from her hands. The sun was fierce this time of day, and she'd been out in it long enough that the back of her neck felt tight. She squinted toward the ridge as if she could see past it to the town she knew was there. "He called on me in April," she said, "and May, and June." "I know that," Clara said. "The whole town knows that. Evelyn, what are you going to—" "I don't know yet," Evelyn said. The honesty of it seemed to catch Clara off guard. She'd expected something more composed, something more like the version of Evelyn Harper that everyone knew, the one who always seemed to have already worked through her feelings before they arrived on her face. But this Evelyn looked tired. Not the tired of not having slept, but the tired of having been patient for a very long time, without the patience resolving into anything. "He's a good man," Clara offered, tentatively. "I know he is," Evelyn said. "And he's offering—" "I know what he's offering, Clara." A silence. The garden smelled of warm earth and broken stems. A hawk turned lazy circles above the east pasture. "Do you want to marry him?" Clara asked, finally, because she'd known Evelyn long enough to sometimes just ask the direct thing. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said. And then more quietly, with the quality of something being admitted rather than stated, "But I don't know how much longer I can keep saying no to everyone." Clara didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything useful to say. She stood there with the afternoon heat pressing down on both of them, and she thought she almost understood something, though she couldn't quite name it, and then Evelyn turned back to the garden and the conversation was over. In town, Gideon Barrett had settled in at the hotel. the Blackridge Arms, which was a grand name for a 14-room building with a reliable kitchen, and Randall Priest had gone to see about a notary, and the afternoon proceeded in the way that afternoons do in small towns when something is about to happen, with a kind of charged, suppressed energy that everybody felt and nobody acknowledged directly. Silas finished with the gelding. He saw to a mare that had come in from the Caldwell place with a stone bruise that needed attention, and a pair of draft horses belonging to the freight line that stopped through 3 times a week. He did all of this with his usual economy of movement, his usual quiet focus, and the whole time the thing he was not thinking about moved through the back of his mind like weather he could feel but hadn't named. It was past 4 in the afternoon when Ben Colby arrived. Ben was Silas's oldest friend. They'd grown up 2 streets apart, had spent their adolescence in one kind of trouble or another, had grown into adults with more sense and less proximity, but the kind of friendship that didn't require regularity to stay solid. Ben worked at the feed store now, was married, had 2 small boys, and had a habit of speaking plainly that Silas generally appreciated. He came in without knocking. The stable didn't have much in the way of doors to knock on, and found Silas cleaning tack at the bench along the east wall. "You heard about Barrett," Ben said. "Tommy Hatch told me at noon." "Then you know what it means." "He's going to make a formal proposal." Ben leaned against the wall and folded his arms. He was a compact man, sandy-haired, with the specific expression he wore when he'd decided something and was determining how to say it. "Silas," he said. "Ben, don't do that." "Do what?" "That thing you do where you act like something's not happening." Ben pushed off the wall and took 3 steps toward him. "I've known you since we were 7 years old. I've watched you carry something around for the better part of 3 years and say absolutely nothing about it." Silas kept cleaning the harness he was holding. His hands didn't stop. "I don't know what you think you've been watching," he said. "I think I've been watching a man who cares about a woman in a way that most men don't get to experience. And I think I've been watching that same man talk himself out of doing anything about it every single day." Ben's voice wasn't heated. He wasn't a man who got heated easily, but it had the specific weight of someone who'd been carrying a frustration for a while and had decided tonight it was coming out. And now Gideon Barrett is at the hotel with his lawyer, and if you think Evelyn Harper is going to keep saying no forever without someone giving her a reason— "She can make her own decision," Silas said. "I know she can," Ben said. That's not the point. The point is she's been making the same decision for 3 years and you haven't bothered to give her any information that might change it." Silas set down the harness. He turned and looked at Ben with an expression that was more open than he usually allowed himself in conversation. Not quite raw, but not armored either. "Ben," he said, "what exactly are you suggesting I do?" "I'm suggesting," Ben said, "that you go tell her. Whatever it is you've been not saying. Before Gideon Barrett says it for you, except it's going to be a different thing, and it's going to be permanent." The stable was quiet around them. One of the horses shifted in its stall. The evening light was coming in at a low angle through the gap in the west wall, filling the space with something golden and specific. "She's never—" Silas started. "Has she ever had reason to?" Ben said. "Have you ever given her any signal at all that you were—" He stopped himself. "Silas, has Ruth Caffey ever said anything to you?" A pause. "Ruth said something to you," Silas said. It wasn't a question. Ben rubbed the back of his neck, which was as close as he came to looking uncomfortable. "Ruth said some things to me about a year ago that I maybe should have brought to you sooner, and I didn't because I thought you'd get there on your own, and then you didn't, and now—" He gestured generally at the situation. "Now there's a cattle baron with a lawyer in town." Silas was quiet for a long moment. He thought about Evelyn at the gate last Tuesday, the way she'd looked at him when he'd mentioned he'd fixed the north fence post. Not like it was surprising, just like it was exactly what she'd expected, which was somehow more than surprise. He thought about the coffee she brought, always wrapped to stay warm, always exactly the way he drank it. He thought about the way conversations ended between them, not trailing off but resting, the way you rest something you intend to pick up again. He thought about what Ben had said. Has she ever had reason to? "What did Ruth say?" he asked. Ben looked at him for a moment. Then he said it, plainly, directly, because that was how Ben worked. And the words landed in the still air of the stable and didn't leave. Silas stood there for a moment afterward. He didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't punch a wall or sweep something off the workbench. He just stood there with the information settling into him, rearranging things, and his face changed in the specific way faces change when something that's been uncertain for a long time becomes, quite suddenly, impossible to avoid. "I need to close up," he said. "I know," Ben said. "I'll need an hour." "She'll be home. It's a Tuesday. She doesn't go anywhere on Tuesdays." Silas nodded once and went to do what needed doing before the light ran out. Ruth Caffey was locking up the seamstress shop when she saw Silas cross Main Street with his hat in his hand in a direction to him she recognized. The particular stride of a man who has made a decision and is walking toward it before he can think himself out of it. She watched him go. She didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say at this point. She'd been waiting a long time for this particular walk to happen. She just watched and felt the specific relief of someone who has held a piece of information for longer than it was comfortable, and then she went home. Tut. The road out to the Harper place was 1.5 miles from the edge of town, following a creek bed for the first half before rising over a low ridge and dropping into the smaller valley where the farmstead sat. Silas had walked it hundreds of times. He knew every rut and stone on it. He walked it differently that evening. Not faster, exactly, but with a kind of deliberateness that was different from his usual movement, like a man walking towards something rather than simply between places. The evening air had cooled slightly as the sun lowered, and the creek made its sound beside him, and the first bats were starting their hunting over the water, which meant it was later than he'd thought. He didn't rehearse. He'd tried, walking the first quarter-mile, and the words had sounded wrong in his head. Too formal, too arranged, too much like something assembled rather than something true. He'd stopped trying after that, and just walked. The farmstead came into view over the ridge, the house, white-painted and practical, the barn behind it, the kitchen garden to the south that she kept meticulous in a way his mother would have approved of, the mare and the small paddock near the fence. The lamp was lit in the front room. He stood at the gate for a moment, not hesitating, exactly, more like taking account. Then he opened the gate and went up to the door and knocked. So, Evelyn answered it herself. She almost always answered her own door. She had a housekeeper who came twice a week, but this wasn't one of those days, and she'd grown accustomed to the solitude of the place in a way that still sometimes surprised people who thought a woman alone on 40 acres would seem more diminished by it. She was in her work clothes still, though she'd taken off the apron, and her hair was slightly loose from whatever she'd pinned it into that morning, and she had a book in her hand that she'd clearly just set down to answer the door. She looked at Silas standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, and for just a moment, a fraction of a moment, the kind that passes before the face can arrange itself, she looked like someone who'd been expecting something, or someone, and wasn't entirely sure whether to be afraid of it. "Silas," she said. "Evening, Evelyn," he said. "I'm sorry to come by this late." "It's not late." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in. The front room was lit warm and comfortable, books on the shelves her father had built, the furniture not fancy but chosen with care, a braided rug on the floor that he'd seen her making over several months the previous winter. The room smelled of the supper she'd already had, something with herbs, and the particular smell of old wood and lamplight that he associated specifically with this house. "I heard Barrett's in town," he said. He stood near the door because he hadn't been invited to sit, and in this context it didn't feel right to assume. "Word travels," Evelyn said. She was watching him with the careful attention she usually kept better managed than this. There was something slightly unguarded about her tonight, the edges of her composure not quite as seamless as usual. "Clara came by this afternoon." "I know what he's there for," Silas said. "So does everyone." A silence. Not an uncomfortable one exactly, but weighted, full of the things that hadn't been said yet and needed to be, and the awareness on both sides that they were arriving at a moment that had been a long time coming. "I need to tell you something," Silas said. Evelyn set the book she was still holding down on the side table. She clasped her hands in front of her in a gesture that might have looked composed if he hadn't known her well enough to recognize it as the thing she did when she was steadying herself. "All right," she said. He looked at her across the few feet of warm lamplight between them. He looked at the face he'd been looking at for 3 years with the specific, restrained attention of a man who'd been teaching himself not to look too long or too directly, and he thought, "This is the thing. Right now, this is the thing. I've been—" He started. Stopped. Tried again. I care about you, Evelyn. Not in the way a neighbor cares. Not in the way a person cares about someone they respect. In the way that... He stopped again. And this time he seemed genuinely frustrated with himself, which was unusual enough that it shifted something in the room. I'm not good at this. I've been telling myself that for 3 years, and I've been using it as a reason not to try, and I don't think that's... He paused. I don't think that's been fair to you. Evelyn was very still. What I'm saying, Silas said, is that I care about you in the way that means I should have said something a long time ago. And I didn't because I'd talked myself into believing that you couldn't, that a woman like you wouldn't... He stopped, shook his head slightly. That was my problem, not yours. It was my own fear, and I dressed it up as consideration for you, and I think that was wrong. The lamp flickered once, briefly, in some small draft. Evelyn looked at him with the expression of someone who has been waiting to hear something and is in the process of making sure they're actually hearing it, that it's real, and not some wishful reconstruction of something more ordinary. Are you telling me, she said carefully, that you have feelings for me that you've been keeping to yourself for 3 years? He met her eyes. Yes, he said. That's what I'm telling you. The quiet that followed was the kind that lives between things, between the said and the not yet said, between the question and its answer, between one version of the future and another. She looked at him for a long moment, and then something in her face, the careful, managed composure of a woman who had learned to hold things in without letting them show, came quietly undone. It didn't break. It didn't collapse. It just let go. The way a hand lets go of something it's been holding for a very long time. Silas Mercer, she said, and her voice was slightly unsteady in a way that he'd never once heard from her before, which was more affecting than anything she could have said. What on earth took you so long? He stood there for a moment, understanding that the question wasn't rhetorical, and that it was not angry, and that what it genuinely was exhausted relief. Fear, he said. Mostly fear. Mostly? Some stubbornness. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. It was too complicated to be a simple laugh, but close enough. I've been refusing men for 3 years, she said. Her voice was steadier now, though her hands were still clasped, and the clasp was tight. Good men, some of them. Men with land and money and better prospects than a stable in Black Ridge Crossing. She stopped. Do you know why? He thought about what Ben had said, what Ruth had apparently told Ben, in confidence, a year ago. He thought he knew. But he didn't say it, because this was not the moment for telling her what he thought he knew. This was the moment for listening. Why? He said. She looked at him with the direct, unflinching attention that had always been one of the things he admired most about her, the way she looked at things she meant to understand. Because none of them were you, she said. Simple as that. No decoration on it, just the fact stated plainly, the way she stated most things. The lamp burned steady. The mare moved in the paddock outside. Somewhere down the road, a coyote called once and stopped. Silas Mercer stood in the warm light of Evelyn Harper's front room and felt something he didn't have a precise name for. Something in the chest, something that had been contracted for a very long time, loosening all at once, quietly, the way ice goes in spring, not with a crash, but with a slow, certain yielding to the warmth that was always coming. I'm sorry it took me so long, he said. She shook her head just slightly. You're here now. And that, for the moment, was enough. He stayed another hour. Not because there was anything formal to settle. Nothing had been settled, not yet, not in any way that either of them could put a name to. But the conversation that had been building for 3 years didn't fully exhaust itself in one exchange, and neither of them seemed in a hurry to end it now that it had finally started. Evelyn made coffee. It was too late for coffee, practically speaking, but she made it anyway, and Silas sat at the kitchen table. The first time he'd ever sat there rather than standing near the door or on the porch. And the two of them talked the way people talk when they've just opened a door that has been closed for a very long time. Not about everything, not all at once, but about the things that were easiest to say first, the ones closest to the surface, the ones that didn't require as much excavation. She asked him when he'd known. He was quiet for a moment, the way he got quiet when he was being genuinely careful rather than evasive. And then he told her 2.5 years ago, the morning her fence had come down in a February storm and he'd come out before first light because he'd heard the wind and known she'd have trouble, and she'd met him at the gate with a lantern, and she'd looked tired and grateful, and not at all like she was performing either of those things, and something had simply clarified. That was the word he used. Clarified. Like a lens adjusting. She listened to this without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I made you breakfast that morning, eggs and salt pork." "I remember. You thanked me like I'd done you a favor." "You had." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "I was the one who was grateful, Silas." He didn't say anything to that. He just sat with it, the way he sat with most things, without rushing to fill the space around it. She told him her own version of the timeline, which was longer than his and, if he was honest, somewhat humbling. She said she'd noticed him, really noticed him, in the way that meant something before her father died. Back when Douglas was still alive and Silas was just the man who ran the stable, who spoke to her father with respect that wasn't manufactured. She said she'd watched him with the horses once, through the stable door, and there had been something in the way he moved through that space, the patience of it, the unhurried competence that had lodged itself in her mind and didn't leave. "I tried not to think about it," she said. "After Father died and you started coming around to help, I told myself it was just the situation, that I was lonely and you were there, and that was all it was." "Was it?" "No," she said simply. He nodded. He looked at the table for a moment, then back up at her. "Did Ruth know?" he asked. The slight change in Evelyn's expression told him the answer before she said it. "Ruth knows most things before the people involved do." A pause. "Did she say something to Ben?" "Apparently about a year ago." Evelyn set her cup down. "Ben Colby," she said, in the tone of someone filing a piece of information away, "and he waited a year to tell you. He thought I'd get there on my own." "Did he tell you that?" "More or less." She was quiet for a moment. There was something working behind her expression, something between amusement and a more complicated feeling that he couldn't fully read. "A year," she said. "I know. While I was—" She stopped herself. Started again. "While Gideon Barrett was calling on me. While the whole town was speculating about what I was going to do. While I was trying to figure out how much longer I could reasonably hold out before—" She stopped again. Her jaw tightened slightly, which was the closest she came to visible frustration. "I'm sorry," Silas said. "Silas." "I'm not angry at you," she said. And she meant it. He could tell she meant it, because Evelyn Harper didn't say things she didn't mean, which was one of the things that had always made her both easy and difficult to be around. "I'm just—" She exhaled. "I'm tired, Silas. I've been patient for a very long time." "I know. I don't think you fully know," she said. Not harshly, just honestly. Because you could have said nothing, and it would have cost you nothing except the thing you were already not having. But I had to keep saying no to men and watching the town draw conclusions about me and wondering if I was— She paused. "If I was being a fool." The words sat between them in the lamplight. "You weren't," he said. "I know that now." She picked up her cup again. Her hands were steady. "But I didn't always know it." He sat with the weight of that for a moment. It was uncomfortable, as it was meant to be. Not as an accusation exactly, but as a truth he needed to understand rather than smooth over. "What happens now?" he asked. She looked at him across the table. The lamp had burned lower while they'd been talking, and the light had gone warmer and slightly unsteady, and she looked in that light less like the composed and capable woman the town knew and more like herself, whoever that was, underneath the reputation. "I don't know yet," she said. "I know what I want, but there are things to work out." "Gideon," he said. "Yes." "What are you going to tell him?" "The truth," she said. "I always tell people the truth. It's less efficient in the short term, but it's tidier in the long run." There was a pause, and then Silas did something he almost never did in conversation, which was smile. Not the polite smile he used for customers or the reflexive smile of social acknowledgement, but the real one, the one that changed his whole face, that made him look younger and somewhat less guarded than he usually appeared. Evelyn saw it, and something shifted in her expression in response. Not a smile exactly, but something adjacent to one. "Go home, Silas," she said. "It's late." "It is," he agreed. He stood, picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the corner of the table. "Evelyn, I know," she said. "I know." He didn't say anything else. He went to the door, and she walked him to it, and he stepped out into the night air that had cooled fully now and smelled of grass and creek water and the specific, unnameable scent of summer darkness in open country. He walked home without thinking about the road. He didn't sleep well. Not badly, either. It wasn't the sleeplessness of anxiety, exactly. More the sleeplessness of a man whose mind has received too much information and is quietly working through it, arranging and rearranging, trying to understand the shape of a thing that had only just taken form. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the town settle around him and thought about what she'd said. "I was trying to figure out how much longer I could hold out." He turned that over a few times. He was not generally a man who punished himself. Self-flagellation struck him as a kind of indulgence, a way of making yourself the center of a story that involved other people. But he understood that he had cost her something by being silent, and that understanding settled in him with the quiet, uncomfortable weight of genuine accountability. He'd been afraid. He knew that. He'd always known that, though he dressed it up as consideration for her, as not wanting to presume, as the reasonable caution of a man who understood his own limitations. All of that was real enough in its way, but it was also true that underneath all of it was simple fear. The fear of a man who had grown up understanding that some things are not available to him, who had learned early that wanting something too visibly was the first step toward its denial. He had, he now understood, applied that lesson in a place where it didn't belong. He fell asleep around 2 in the morning and woke at 5, which was his usual time regardless of what the previous night had contained, and went to work. The town was a different thing in the early morning, before the day had fully organized itself. Main Street was quiet except for the freight wagon that came through at first light and the occasional figure moving between buildings with the purposeful economy of someone who had a specific place to be. Silas opened the stable, fed the horses in his care, cleaned what needed cleaning, and did it all with his hands on the work while his mind was somewhere else. He was reshoeing a bay mare when Ben Colby appeared just after 7, earlier than he usually showed up for anything that wasn't emergency business. Ben stood in the doorway, reading Silas's face with the practiced attention of a man who'd known him a long time. "You went," Ben said. "I went." "And?" Silas kept working. After a moment, he said, "You knew what Ruth told you for a year." Ben had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. You thought I'd figure it out on my own." "You're generally good at figuring things out." "Not this," Silas said. He said it without heat. "Not this particular thing." Ben leaned against the doorframe. "How did it go?" Silas was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was deciding how much to say rather than deciding what he felt. "It went," he said, "the way I should have gone 2 years ago." Ben absorbed this. He nodded slowly, with the expression of a man who is glad something has happened and also aware that his own delay contributed to it not happening sooner. "She all right?" "She's—" Silas paused. He reached for the word and found the only one that was accurate. "She's relieved and tired, and she's still got Barrett to deal with." Ben winced slightly. "What's she gonna do?" "Tell him the truth. That's what she said." "That's Evelyn," Ben said, with the slight combination of admiration and apprehension that the phrase tended to carry from people who knew her. Silas looked up from the shoe. "You should have told me a year ago, Ben." Ben met his eyes. He didn't make excuses, which was one of the things Silas valued about him. "I should have," he said. "I'm sorry." Silas held the look for another moment, then went back to the shoe. The conversation was over. Well, Gideon Barrett was a man who liked mornings. He was up before 6, downstairs in the hotel dining room before the kitchen had fully committed to breakfast, drinking coffee by the window and looking out at the street with the alert, patient expression of a man who had learned to use quiet hours productively. He had not sent word to Evelyn yet. He intended to, that morning, a note brought by the hotel boy, formally requesting to call on her at her convenience, which was the proper way to proceed. Randall Priest had the necessary documents in order. The offer he intended to make was straightforward and, he believed, fair, more than fair. He was not a man who undervalued what he was asking for. He'd been thinking about Evelyn Harper with the same systematic attention he brought to any significant decision. He'd cataloged her qualities the way he cataloged the qualities of land he was considering purchasing, not coldly, but practically. She was intelligent. She managed her place well. She was liked without being soft. She said what she thought without being aggressive about it. She would not be lost in a larger household the way some women were. She would find her footing and keep it. He had also, if he was being entirely honest, found himself genuinely looking forward to her company in a way that surprised him slightly. She was not a woman who performed interest. When she asked a question, she meant to know the answer, and when she listened, she was actually listening. After 2 widowhoods and several decades of managing a large operation surrounded by people whose primary relationship to him was economic, that quality felt, unexpectedly, like something he hadn't known he was missing. He was not in love with her. He was honest enough with himself to know that, but he thought that what he was offering was substantial, and that it could become something, with time, and that the alternative, continuing as he had been, held less appeal to him every year. He was on his 2nd cup of coffee when Thomas Aldridge, an acquaintance who'd been one of the links in the chain that had first brought Evelyn Harper to his attention, came into the dining room and sat down across from him without being invited, which Aldridge was the kind of man who did. "Morning, Gideon." "Thomas." Aldridge poured himself coffee from the pot the kitchen girl had left. He was a sociable man, comfortable in spaces, the kind of person who filled rooms with his presence without especially meaning to. "I hear you're making your move." "I'm calling on Miss Harper." "Yes." Aldridge nodded, in the measured way of someone who is about to say something he's calculated the saying of. "Hear anything about Silas Mercer lately?" Gideon looked at him over his cup. "The stable man. That's him." Aldridge wasn't making it a story, which Gideon respected. He was just reporting, the way a useful informant reports, clean and factual. "He walked out to her place last night, late. Stayed about an hour." Gideon set his cup down. He didn't say anything immediately, which was a habit of his, absorbing information before responding to it. "How late?" he said. "Past 8, probably closer to 9. Gideon considered this. His face did not change particularly, but behind it something was recalibrating, slowly, without drama. "He'd been out there before?" he asked. "Regularly, for 3 years or more." Aldridge paused. I don't think it's improper, understand. From what people say, they're friends, close neighbors, but..." He paused again. "He doesn't usually go out at night." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the window at Main Street, which was beginning to move as the morning established itself. He watched a man lead a horse past. He watched the hotel boy cross toward the post office. "Thomas," he said, "are you telling me there's a reason I shouldn't proceed?" Aldridge met his eyes. "I'm telling you what I heard. What you do with it is your business." Gideon nodded once, slowly. He picked up his coffee cup again, found it empty, set it back down. "Thank you," he said. Aldridge took his coffee and moved to another table to talk to someone else, which was what he did, and Gideon sat alone by the window and looked at the morning and thought about the nature of investments and the wisdom of proceeding when you didn't have full information. He was a man who had built his fortune partly on knowing when not to move. He sat there another 10 minutes. Then he called for a fresh pot of coffee and told the kitchen girl he'd be having breakfast after all, and took the note he'd been composing in his head and held it in reserve for the moment. Ruth Caffey knew before noon. She wasn't a gossip. She had a genuine distaste for the idle, unkind variety of small-town information passing, the kind that existed to diminish people. But she was observant, and she was connected, and she had an interest in this particular situation that predated everyone else's by several years. So when she heard from the hotel girl that Gideon Barrett had not sent a note to the Harper place that morning, and when she processed that against what she already knew about the previous night, she put the pieces together with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose patience had finally been rewarded. She stopped by the stable just before noon. Silas was in the yard outside, checking the axle on a wagon that had been brought in with a problem. He looked up when he heard her step, and he didn't say anything, which was his way. "Well," Ruth said. She was a direct woman, small, dark-haired, with eyes that had the particular quality of seeing more than they let on. About time. Ruth, don't Ruth me. She folded her arms. I've been watching this particular slow disaster for 3 years, and I want you to know that if you'd waited another month, I was going to say something to you myself. Ben Colby's discretion be damned. Silas looked at her. He almost smiled. I know you would have. How is she? He thought about the kitchen, the low lamp, the coffee, the way her voice had gone unsteady for just a moment, that single moment of unmistakable, unmanaged feeling. She's all right, he said. She had to sit with it for a long time by herself. That's not easy. Ruth nodded. Her expression softened slightly, in the way it did when she set aside the brisk exterior she used for general navigation of the world. She's stronger than anyone gives her credit for, including herself sometimes. I know. What are you going to do? Talk to her again, properly. Do this properly. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Barrett's still at the hotel, she said. Aldridge was in the dining room this morning with him. The note never got sent. Silas absorbed this. He knows something. He knows you went out there last night. Whether he knows what it means, Ruth shrugged. He's a smart man, Gideon. I don't think he'd miss it. Silas was quiet. He looked at the wagon axle, then back at her. What do you know about him? Honestly. Ruth considered it with the seriousness it deserved. He's not a bad man, she said. He's been decent to people here. He's got pride, but not the cruel kind. He genuinely wanted her. I believe that, in his way. She paused. I think he'll handle a no better than some would. She'll tell him today, Silas said. Or tomorrow. She doesn't let things sit when they need addressing. No, Ruth agreed. She doesn't. She stayed another few minutes talking about nothing consequential, the way close friends do after something significant, returning to the surface, giving the deeper things time to settle. Then she went back to the shop, and Silas went back to the axle, and the morning continued. Evelyn sent a note to the hotel just before 2 in the afternoon. She had thought about it most of the morning, not about whether to send it, but about what to say. She wasn't a woman who avoided hard conversations. She'd had enough of them in her life to know that avoidance only deferred the weight and let it gather interest. But she also understood that what she was doing was refusing a man who had treated her with consistent respect, who had made her a serious offer, who had not been unreasonable in any way she could point to. That deserved care. The note was brief. She asked if he would be willing to meet with her, at his convenience, to speak privately. She did not give reasons in the note, which she thought was better. Reasons in a note could be taken apart and argued with in a way that reasons spoken in person, with a real person present, could not. Gideon's reply came back within the hour. He would be available at 4 if that suited her, at the hotel dining room. It suited her. She arrived at 4 exactly, which was the way Evelyn did most things. Not early, not late, present at exactly the agreed moment. She was in town clothes, not her work things, though she hadn't dressed elaborately, because elaborateness would have felt like performance, and this was not a situation she wanted to perform. Gideon was already at the table near the window. He stood when she came in, which she appreciated. He had consistent manners, which was a thing she'd noticed and noted. Miss Harper, he said, Mr. Barrett, thank you for seeing me on short notice. It's never short notice where you're concerned, he said, which was a courtly thing, the kind he occasionally produced when the formality of a situation called for it. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. He sat. The kitchen girl came, and they both declined anything, which in itself said something about the nature of the conversation they were both prepared for. Gideon looked at her across the table with the direct, comfortable attention of a man who did not find difficult conversations frightening. That was something, at least. I suspect, he said, that I know what you're going to say. You might, she said. She met his eyes. I'm not going to say it unkindly. I didn't expect you would. He was quiet for a moment. Is it the stable man? She didn't look away. Yes, he nodded. Once, slowly, the way he'd nodded at Aldridge that morning, absorbing rather than reacting. He looked at the table, then back up at her. How long? He asked. A few years, she said. For both of us, as it turns out. We were slower about it than we should have been. Something moved through Gideon's expression. Not anger, not quite. More like the specific feeling of a man who has reviewed a situation and understood where the failure of information lay. "I see," he said. And then, more quietly, "I wish you'd told me earlier, not as a reproach. I just could have—" He paused. "I would have proceeded differently." "I know," she said. "That's partly on me. I should have been clear about where I stood earlier in the spring. I told myself I hadn't decided, and that was true, but I wasn't being entirely honest about what I was waiting for." She paused. "That wasn't fair to you, and I'm sorry for it." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something genuine in his expression, not wounded exactly, but real in a way that surprised her slightly. He had not been performing interest in her. Whatever his reasons, whatever the practical calculations involved, there had been something real in it for him, and she respected him enough to acknowledge that. "He's a good man?" Gideon asked. "He is," she said. "He's not—" She considered how to say it honestly. "He's not what you are. Not in terms of resources or position, but he's—" She thought about a February morning, a gate, a lantern. "He's the person I want." Gideon sat with that for a moment. He looked out the window at Main Street, then back at her. Something in his face had settled, not into acceptance, exactly, but into the kind of resolve that a capable man uses to meet a situation he can't change. "I appreciate you telling me directly," he said. "Some women would have just—" He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood. Some women would have written a note or had someone else manage it, or simply disappeared behind polite unavailability until he gave up. She hadn't done any of those things. "It wouldn't have been respectful," she said. "No." He picked up the coffee cup in front of him, left over from before she'd arrived, turned it in his hands. "I won't pretend it's not a disappointment. I wouldn't believe you if you did." A silence. It was not entirely comfortable, but it was honest, which was its own kind of value. "He knows what he has," Gideon said finally. Not as a question, more as something he was determining, out loud. "He's getting there," Evelyn said. Something crossed Gideon's face that might, in a different context, have been a wry acknowledgement. He set the cup down. He straightened in his chair. "Well," he said. He extended his hand across the table. "I hope it goes well for you, Miss Harper. I mean that without reservation." She took his hand and shook it. A real handshake, firm, without delicacy. "I believe you," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Barrett, for being decent about this." "I've been called many things," he said. "Decent is one I'll accept." She left the hotel at 4:15. The afternoon was still warm, the light angled, the street busy with the end-of-day movement of a town finishing its work. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment and looked at it, the horses, the dust, the storefronts she'd known her entire life, and felt the particular feeling of a decision fully made and fully stated, which was not happiness exactly, but something more durable. She walked to the stable. Silas looked up when she came through the wide door and into the cool interior. He'd been finishing the evening feed, moving through the stalls with the unhurried routine of a man who'd done this so many times it had become as natural as breathing. He stopped when he saw her. He read her face in the way he read most things, carefully, without rushing. "You talked to him," he said. "I talked to him." He waited. "It's done," she said. "He took it well. He's a good man." Silas nodded. He set down the bucket he was holding. He leaned against the stall door and looked at her with that direct, quiet attention she'd always found both steadying and, lately, something more than that. "Evelyn," he said. "Silas." "I'd like to come calling," he said. "Properly, with your permission." It was a formal way of saying it, the formal language of a time and place where these things had procedures, and the formality should have felt slightly awkward, except that it didn't. It felt instead like the right container for something real, like the frame around a thing that mattered. She looked at him standing there in the dim, warm light of the stable he'd run for 12 years, hat off, leaning against a stall door, looking at her like a man who had finally said the true thing and was waiting to see if the world would hold. "I think," Evelyn Harper said, "that I would like that very much." The horses moved into their stalls. Outside, the town was settling into evening. The long summer day was finally giving up its light, going golden at the edges. the kind of ending that made no promises about tomorrow and didn't need to. The news moved through Black Ridge Crossing the way most news did, sideways, in pieces, arriving at different people in different forms depending on who their source was and what that source had chosen to include or omit. By Thursday morning, 2 days after Evelyn's meeting with Gideon at the hotel, the general shape of the story was known to most of the town. Gideon Barrett had not made his formal proposal. He and Randall Priest had departed on the Wednesday stage, Gideon with the particular composure of a man who had absorbed a setback without making it public. Priest with the slightly frustrated expression of a lawyer who had prepared documents that would not be used. They'd left before 8 in the morning, which was efficient and graceful, and told the town everything it needed to know about how it had gone without requiring any direct statement. What the town was less certain about was the other half of the story. That Silas Mercer had walked out to the Harper place Tuesday night was known to perhaps 4 or 5 people through direct observation or reliable second-hand account. That something had changed between them was suspected by Ruth Caffey and Ben Colby's wife, Nora, who had spoken to Ben and extracted more than he'd probably intended to give. That Evelyn had gone to the stable Wednesday afternoon and stayed for a full 20 minutes before walking home was noted by Agnes Whitfield, who had been coming out of the dry goods store at the right moment and had no particular investment in the information except the general human one. Put together, these pieces formed a picture that the town was in the process of assembling, with the collective enthusiasm of people who have been watching a situation develop for 3 years and feel entitled to its resolution. The reactions were not uniform. Margaret Holt, who was 64 and had lived in the valley since before the town had its current name, told her daughter over breakfast Thursday morning that she'd always thought Silas Mercer was a fine man and that the whole business had taken long enough to suit her. She said this with the mild authority of someone who'd watched several generations of romantic complications resolve themselves and had learned to identify the ones that were going to work out eventually. Her daughter, who was 32 and had her own opinions about men in general, said that she hoped Evelyn knew what she was getting into, choosing a man with no real property to speak of. Margaret said that property was a thing you could build and common sense was a thing you either had or you didn't, and that Silas had always struck her as possessing the second in sufficient quantity to compensate for the first. Her daughter was not entirely persuaded, but she let it go. At the barbershop, the opinion was more mixed. Ed Crane, who cut hair and traded information with roughly equal skill, offered the view that Evelyn Harper was a sensible woman who'd made a puzzling choice, and that if Gideon Barrett, 20,000 acres, twice her age, twice widowed, wasn't good enough, he didn't know what standard she was applying. His customer at the moment, a rancher named Cole who'd been in the valley 15 years, said that Barrett's age and acreage weren't the point, and that a woman who'd been running her own 40 acres for 3 years without assistance from any husband didn't necessarily need to be making decisions based on land she didn't choose to acquire herself. Ed Crane considered this. "She's taking on a stableman," he said. "She's taking on Silas Mercer," Cole said, which is not the same thing. The distinction was left to sit there, which was the honest move because both of them knew it was true. Carl Braddock, the first man Evelyn had turned down, now 7 years married to a woman from Casper, heard the news from his ranch foreman and stood in the yard for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read, then went back inside and said nothing about it at dinner. His wife, who knew him well enough to notice, did not ask. Some information a person had to process privately, and she knew that, and she respected it. James Whitfield heard it from his father, who mentioned it while reviewing the store accounts, with the deliberate casualness of a man trying to deliver difficult information neutrally. James said, "Ah," and continued reviewing the column of figures in front of him, and the conversation moved on to inventory. He was, by all available evidence, fine. He was engaged to a woman from Laramie now, and they seemed genuinely suited to each other, and the thing he'd felt for Evelyn Harper had softened over time into a kind of retrospective understanding. That what he'd wanted from her was not what she would have been, and that the refusal, while it had stung at the time, had possibly saved them both from a significant mutual disappointment. He still had complicated feelings. He was honest enough to admit that to himself. But complicated feelings were not the same as unresolved ones. Ruth Caffey heard the official version from Evelyn herself Thursday afternoon, when Evelyn came into the shop for what she claimed was a fitting adjustment on a skirt she'd had made in the spring, which was true as far as it went, but not the primary reason for the visit. Ruth made her stand on the fitting platform and worked at the hem with pins while Evelyn talked. This was, Ruth had found, the most effective arrangement for conversations of this kind. Giving the person something to look at other than you, some neutral physical activity to occupy their hands or their attention, freed up the more private things. "He's coming Saturday," Evelyn said, "to call on me. Properly." Ruth put a pin in the hem. "Properly. He asked permission. He was formal about it." A pause. "I think he was nervous." "I should hope so," Ruth said. "He's had long enough to work up to it." She sat back on her heels and looked up at Evelyn with the direct expression she used when she was being entirely honest. "How are you?" "I don't know yet," Evelyn said, which Ruth knew was actually a very good sign. Evelyn saying she didn't know yet meant she was feeling something real, something she hadn't yet organized into a manageable shape, as opposed to the composed, already processed version of herself she presented when she wanted to avoid examination. "Are you scared?" Ruth asked. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The clock on the wall ticked. A fly buzzed against the window and gave up. "A little," she said. "Not of him. Of whether I've been carrying an idea of him for 3 years that isn't the real thing, whether I've been waiting for something I imagined." Ruth turned back to the hem. "Have you imagined him?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, have you built a version of Silas Mercer in your head that's been sitting with you for 3 years and might be different from the man who shows up Saturday? Have you been in love with a real person or a story about a person?" The question sat in the air between them, sharp and direct in the way Ruth's questions tended to be when she thought sharpness was warranted. Evelyn looked down at her. "That's not a comfortable thing to ask." "No," Ruth agreed, "but it's a useful one." Another silence. Evelyn looked at the window, at the light coming through it, at the street she could half see through the glass. "He surprised me," she said finally, "Tuesday night when he came. He didn't say what I expected him to say, the way I expected him to say it. He stumbled a bit. He admitted he'd been afraid. He said things that were imperfect, and I thought—" She paused. "I thought, that's him. That's the actual person. And I wasn't disappointed." Ruth nodded slowly, working at another pin. "That's your answer," she said. Evelyn looked down at her. "If the real, stumbling, imperfect version of him had disappointed you," Ruth said, "that would have been information worth having before Saturday. But it didn't. So you're not in love with an idea." She glanced up briefly. "You're in love with the man, who happens to also be, most of the time, a little bit too quiet and a little bit too in his own head and a little bit too slow to the point." "Ruth." "I like him," Ruth said. "I've always liked him. I'm just saying he's not without flaws, and apparently neither are you. Since between the two of you it took 3 years and a cattle baron to get to a Tuesday night conversation that was 17 minutes long." Evelyn looked at her for a moment, and then, despite herself, she laughed. Not the polite laugh she used in social situations, but the real one, surprised out of her, with a slight edge of exasperation in it, the way laughter sometimes came when something was genuinely funny and also genuinely annoying. 17 minutes, she said. "Ben timed it," Ruth said calmly, pinning another section of hem. "Give or take. Ben Colby stood outside my house, and he wasn't outside your house. He just noticed when Silas left and what time it was. He's a naturally observant person." Ruth sat back and surveyed the hem with the critical eye of someone assessing work. "He felt bad about the year, I think. It was his way of paying attention." Evelyn shook her head slowly. "This town," she said, but without particular heat. "This town has been watching you for 3 years," Ruth said. "You can't blame it for paying attention now that something's finally happening." Silas, for his part, was spending Thursday in the specific state of a man who has taken an action he knows was right and is now waiting to see what it costs him, which is a different kind of worry than the one that precedes the action, and in some ways more wearing. He was not second-guessing himself. He was clear on that. The conversation in Evelyn's kitchen, the one at the stable Wednesday afternoon, were not things he regretted, and he had the kind of temperament that, once it had made peace with the decision, generally kept that peace. But he was aware that he was in new territory, that the arrangement of his life which had, until Tuesday, been known and manageable, had shifted into something less defined, and that the shift, while welcome, required adjustment. He was also, if he was honest about it, nervous about Saturday. Not in the way he'd been nervous about Tuesday. That had been the fear of a man about to say something irreversible. This was a different kind, more specific. The nervousness of a man who knows that the person he's going to see has had 3 years to build an expectation, and who is aware of the gap between what he is and what might have been imagined. He was 41 years old. He was wrong. Silas was 31, not 41, and he ran a stable in a small town in Wyoming, and he was not, by any objective measure, a remarkable prospect. He knew that. He'd always known it. And while Tuesday night had dismantled the specific fear that she didn't want him, it hadn't addressed the adjacent fear, which was slightly harder to articulate, that she would want him, but that he would fail the wanting, that he would show up Saturday and every Saturday after, and over time the gap between what she'd believed him to be and what he actually was would become visible, and what she'd felt would quietly erode. He was thinking about this on Thursday afternoon, working at the bench in the back of the stable, when Tommy Hatch appeared again. Tommy's appearances were a kind of recurring feature of Silas's life, reliable as weather. "Miss Harper's been at the seamstress shop for an hour," Tommy reported, because Tommy had no evident understanding of what information was, and was not relevant to share. "That's her business," Silas said. "People are talking about you," Tommy said. "About you and her. Some people think it's—" He seemed to be searching for a word that wasn't quite available to a 14-year-old. "Strange," he settled on, "that she'd pick you over Mr. Barrett." Silas kept working. He did not look up. "What do you think?" Tommy seemed surprised to be asked. He considered it with the particular seriousness that some 14-year-olds bring to unexpected questions. "I think Mr. Barrett's old," he said, "and I think you've always treated her horses good, which she'd care about." Silas looked up at him then. "That's more perceptive than you usually get credit for, Tommy." Tommy looked uncertain whether that was a compliment. He decided it probably was. "Thanks," he said, and disappeared. Saturday came with the particular quality of mornings that know they matter, clear and warm, the sky the specific shade of blue that appeared in midsummer Wyoming when the air was still and the light had not yet achieved its full afternoon weight. Silas was up before 5, which was normal. He did his morning work at the stable, which was also normal. He ate breakfast, which he prepared himself with the efficiency of a man who had been cooking for himself for 12 years and had no illusions about his own culinary skill. He owned one good suit. It was 3 years old, had been bought for a friend's wedding, fit him acceptably still, though he'd put on some weight in the shoulders since then. He pressed it the previous evening with the specific care of a man who didn't trust himself to get it right on the first attempt. He left for the Harper place at 9:30. He brought nothing. He'd thought about this carefully. What the right thing to bring was, what gesture was appropriate without being excessive. He'd considered flowers, which felt theatrical. He'd considered something practical, but practical gifts on a first formal call felt like he was already trying to negotiate the terms of usefulness before anything was established. He'd decided that what he was bringing was himself, without props, and that was either going to be enough or it wasn't. And he'd prefer to know which sooner rather than later. The walkout was familiar in every physical detail and entirely different in every interior one. The creek sounded the same. The road had the same ruts. The same hawk he'd seen most mornings that week was working the same thermal above the east pasture. But the way the walk registered in him was different, sharper, more present. The way everything becomes slightly more acute when you're moving toward something instead of just through something. Evelyn was on the porch when he came over the ridge. She was sitting with what appeared to be mending, though she set it down when she saw him coming, which he registered without showing that he registered it. She was in a blue dress he hadn't seen before. Not new, he didn't think, but not what she typically wore when he was around, which was usually something more practical. Her hair was pinned up. She looked, he thought, like herself, which was the most honest way he could put it. Not dressed up into something other than what she was, just the version of herself she wore when an occasion asked for it. He came up to the gate. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "Come in." He opened the gate and came up the path and stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He had his hat in his hands, which was becoming a habit in her presence. "You look well," he said. "You look nervous," she said. He considered denying it. "Some," he admitted. "Good," she said. "Sit down." He sat in the chair beside hers, not the rocking chair her father had used, but the other one, the straight-backed one, which he'd sat in before on the porch. It felt familiar under him, which helped slightly. They sat for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have things to say and are working out the order. "The town's talking," she said. "I know. Ed Crane thinks I've made a questionable decision." "Ed Crane's opinion on most things is worth about what his haircuts are worth," Silas said. "Which is not nothing, but not a lot either." Evelyn looked at him with the slight expression she got when something surprised her into amusement. "That's unkind." "It's accurate." She was quiet for a moment. A dog somewhere in the distance made one half-hearted sound and stopped. The mare in the paddock was standing in the near corner with her head over the fence, watching them with the benign curiosity of horses. "I've been thinking," Evelyn said, "about what this looks like. Practically." "What do you mean?" "I mean," she set the mending she'd picked back down again. She turned to face him more directly, which was her signal, he'd learned, that she was moving into something she intended to say carefully. "I have 40 acres. You have the stable. Neither of those things is very large, but they're real, and they're ours. If this—" she paused. "If this becomes what I think it might become, then those two things are going to need to fit together somehow, and I think we should talk about what that looks like before it becomes a question we're answering under pressure." He looked at her. He felt something settle in him. Not relief exactly, but the specific comfort of recognizing someone operating the way you'd hoped they would. "You're already thinking past the courtship," he said. "I've had 3 years to think," she said. "I've had time." He almost smiled. "What have you worked out?" "Not everything," she said, "but some things." She looked at her hands briefly, then back at him. "The stable is yours. It's what you do, and you do it well, and I wouldn't want you to give it up, and I wouldn't expect you to. But 40 acres is more than one person can manage well alone, and I've been managing it adequately, which isn't the same thing." She paused. "I think there are ways to make those two things work. I don't think it's obvious or easy. I think it would take some working out." "It would," he agreed. "Are you—" She stopped. She started again, with the slight adjustment of someone who has rephrased something to make it more accurate. "Are you interested in working it out? Not as a hypothetical, as an actual thing." He looked at her directly. This was the thing about Evelyn that had always required a certain kind of attention. She didn't ornament her questions. She asked what she meant to ask, and she expected the same in return. "Yes," he said. "That's what I'm here for." "You're here to court me," she said, with a slight precision that might have been dryness or might have been nervousness managing itself. "I'm here," he said, "because I want to marry you eventually, if you'll have me, and the courtship is the part that comes first." He held her gaze. "I figured you'd prefer I was direct about that." She was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her expression, something he couldn't fully read, which was unusual because he'd gotten reasonably good at reading her. "You know," she said, "for a man who didn't say anything for 3 years, you've gotten very direct very quickly." "I had 3 years of the alternative," he said. "It didn't work as well." The expression on her face settled into something that was not quite a smile but held the warmth of one. She looked at him for a long moment. In the way she looked at things, she was genuinely trying to understand, and he sat there and let her look because that seemed like the right thing to do. "I'd like to know you better," she said finally. "The real you, not the version I've seen once a week at the fence." "What's the difference?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's why I want to know you better." He nodded. "That's fair." "Tell me something true," she said. "Something I don't already know about you." He thought about it. Not performing the thinking, actually doing it, which took a moment. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I've been told that. I go quiet sometimes for no reason anyone else can see. And it's not about anything that's happened, it's just how I am, and people find it difficult." He paused. "My father was the same way. My mother said it was the one thing she had to decide to accept, and that she did, but that it took some deciding." Evelyn looked at him carefully. "Your mother accepted it." "She did." "How long were they married?" 31 years, until he died." She nodded. She seemed to be measuring something. "I talk too much sometimes," she said, which surprised him slightly. "When I'm anxious about something, I process it out loud and I talk past the point where the other person is still following me, and then I get frustrated that they're not following and talk more to catch them up, which makes it worse." She paused. "Ruth has told me this several times. I don't always know when I'm doing it. He looked at her. "I'll tell you," he said, "if you want me to. You'd have to do it without making me feel—" She gestured vaguely. "Without making me feel talked down to. I'd do it like this," he said. "I'd just wait until there was a natural stopping point and say, 'Evelyn, you lost me at the second fence.'" She blinked at him. "The second fence? That's just a saying. My father used it. Meant you'd gone past where the other person could follow." She was quiet for a moment, apparently processing this. Then she said, "That might work." It might. The morning moved around them. A cloud passed over the sun and moved on. A meadowlark somewhere in the field behind the house made the three-note sound they made in summer. "Silas," she said. "Evelyn?" "Don't go quiet on me today," she said. "Not yet. Not today." He understood what she meant. Not a permanent request. She understood who he was, had just shown him she'd thought about who he was. Just today. Just while they were finding their footing. "I won't," he said. "Today I'll talk." And so he did. He talked about the stable. Not the business of it, but the thing he actually cared about in it, which was the horses themselves, the individual character of them, the way different animals had different intelligence and different fears and different forms of trust. He talked about the winter he'd been 16 and his father had been sick for 2 months, and he'd run the whole operation himself, which had been terrifying and also the first time he'd understood that he could. He talked about the books he'd been reading. There was one about the natural history of the Western Territories that he'd gotten from a traveling salesman last spring and had been working through slowly because he wanted to actually absorb it rather than just get through it. She talked too. About the vegetable operation she was expanding, the calculations she'd made about which crops actually made sense versus which ones she'd tried out of interest and found impractical. About a complicated relationship with a neighbor 3 properties over who'd been encroaching on her north fence line by small degrees for 2 years, and with whom she was building toward a confrontation she didn't particularly want. About her mother, who'd died when Evelyn was 11, who she didn't often speak about publicly but seemed to want to speak about today, for reasons she didn't fully explain. They talked for 2 hours, not without gaps. There were quiet stretches, moments where the conversation rested and neither of them filled the space with anything. And those moments were, Silas found, not uncomfortable. They were the comfortable kind of quiet, the kind that existed between people who weren't performing for each other. He noticed this, and he thought it was perhaps the most important thing about the morning. Around noon, she offered him lunch, which he accepted, and they ate at the kitchen table where they'd sat with coffee Tuesday night, and the conversation changed its register somewhat, became lighter, more practical, moved between the serious things and the ordinary ones the way real conversation does, without announcement. When he left in the early afternoon, she walked him to the gate. "Next Saturday?" he said. "Next Saturday," she said. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He looked at her standing at the gate with the sun on her and the fields behind her and the porch visible over her shoulder, and he thought, this is an actual thing. This is real. "Thank you for today," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Come back." He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that, and the one after that. September arrived with the first cooler air moving down from the northern ranges, the light shifting in the way it did when summer was finished with itself, and the year was beginning its long turn toward winter. The cottonwoods along the creeks started going yellow at the edges. The mornings required a jacket now, which they hadn't in July. The town had, over the preceding weeks, largely adjusted to the fact of Silas Mercer courting Evelyn Harper. The initial surprise had metabolized into opinion, and opinion had settled into the general acceptance that tended to arrive when a situation proved itself more durable than expected. He went out every Saturday. Sometimes he stayed for Sunday dinner as well, which several people noted and most concluded was significant. They were, as Ruth Caffey observed to Nora Colby over tea one afternoon in September, becoming one of those couples, the kind where you stopped seeing them separately after a while, where your mind automatically put them together when one of them came up, where their names started to follow each other in conversation without conscious choice. "He's good for her," Nora said. "She's good for him too," Ruth said. "He laughs more. Have you noticed? He was always such a serious person. She makes him laugh." Nora considered this. "She's always been funny," she said. In that dry way of hers, I don't think most people understood it. He understands it, Ruth said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had seen something true about two people and watched it be confirmed. What Ruth did not say, because she was saving it for the right moment, was what Evelyn had told her the previous week, in the back of the seamstress shop with the lamp going and the town quiet outside. She'd come in with a purpose, which Ruth had recognized before she'd said anything, and she'd sat down and looked at her oldest friend with an expression that was trying to be composed and not quite achieving it. "I think I'm going to say yes," Evelyn had said. "When he asks. I think I know what I want." Ruth had looked at her for a moment, taking the measure of it. Not the decision, but the state of the person making it. "Are you sure?" she'd asked. Not doubtingly, just the question itself, clean. Evelyn had thought about it for a moment. The real kind of thinking, not the quick kind. "I'm not sure about everything," she'd said. "I'm sure about him. I'm sure that I want this. The actual life, not the idea of it." Ruth had nodded. She'd reached out and put her hand over Evelyn's for a moment, which was not something she did often, because physical affection was not naturally her mode, and both of them knew that, which was why it meant something. "Then you'll be all right," Ruth had said. And she'd meant it without reservation, which was the only way Ruth Caffey meant anything. Outside, the September evening had settled into the valley, cool and specific, carrying the smell of the first turning leaves, and the creek water running lower now than it had in summer, and the particular silence of a town at rest that knew, without knowing it knew, that something in its midst was finding its way towards something permanent. October came in quietly, the way it sometimes did before it turned serious. The aspens on the upper ridgeline had gone fully gold, and the cottonwoods along the creek were following, and the mornings carried a cold now that had teeth in it. Not the killing cold of November, not yet, but the kind that reminded you it was coming and that you should take the reminder seriously. Silas had spent the better part of 2 weeks laying an extra feed at the stable, negotiating with the freight line for a winter delivery contract, patching the east wall of the barn where the wind had found a weakness over the summer. He worked with the focused efficiency of a man who knew what winter cost and refused to be caught underprepared. He was also, beneath all of that practical activity, trying to work out the right moment to ask Evelyn Harper to marry him. This was, he was discovering, its own kind of work, less straightforward than patching barn walls, which had the advantage of a clear problem and a clear solution. The question itself he was certain of. He'd been certain of it since early September, when she'd said something at the kitchen table about the north fence line dispute with her neighbor Callum Peters, and he'd realized he was not listening to the content of what she was saying so much as watching the way she said it. The precise, undeceived way she had of describing a problem, the slight edge in her voice when she talked about someone she thought was being dishonest. And he'd thought, with a clarity that surprised him by its completeness, "I want to be in this room for the rest of my life." That part was settled. What he was less certain about was the how of it. He was not a man given to grand arrangements. The idea of organizing something elaborate felt dishonest to who he was, and he suspected it would feel that way to her too, that she would receive an extravagant gesture with the polite attention she gave things she didn't quite trust. What he wanted to do was ask her in a way that was real, that was specific to them, and not borrowed from some general notion of how proposals were supposed to look. He also had the ring. It had been his mother's, a simple thing, gold band with a small garnet set in it, not expensive by any measure that Gideon Barrett would have recognized. His mother had worn it for 31 years, and when she died, it had come to Silas because he was the only one left, and he'd kept it in the small box on his dresser for 4 years without ever thinking about it becoming relevant. He thought about it now. He took it out one evening and looked at it in the lamplight, turned it in his fingers. It was worn smooth on the inside from years of his mother's hand, the gold slightly irregular in the way handmade things were irregular. The garnet was a deep red, small but clear. It was not a showy object, it was just a real one. He put it in his jacket pocket the following Saturday and told himself he'd find the right moment, or he wouldn't, and if he didn't, he'd try again the week after. He found it, though not in any way he'd planned. The morning had gone normally enough. He'd arrived at 9:30, they'd had coffee, they'd spent an hour working together on the section of fence that bordered the Peters property. The dispute with Callum Peters had escalated to the point where Evelyn had decided the most effective response was to make the fence so unambiguously clear and solid that there was nothing left to argue about, and Silas had agreed that this was probably the right approach. And they'd worked side by side through the morning in the companionable, practical way they developed over the preceding months, talking sometimes and quiet other times, passing tools without needing to ask. After lunch, she'd been restless. He could tell because she reorganized the kitchen shelf that didn't need reorganizing while he was drying the dishes, and she did it with the slightly displaced energy of someone who had something in their head that their hands were trying to address. He'd waited. They'd walked out to check on the mare in the afternoon because the mare had been slightly off her feed the previous week and Evelyn was watching her carefully. The horse was fine, eating normally, moving without trouble, and Evelyn had stood at the paddock fence with her arms folded over the top rail, watching her, and Silas had stood beside her, and the afternoon was very still and very clear and smelled of dry grass and coming cold. "Callum Peters came by yesterday," Evelyn said. Silas looked at her. "Came to the door," which he's never done before. She was watching the mare, not him. "Said he wanted to discuss the fence line man-to-man, which—" She stopped. "Which implied the previous discussions hadn't been," Silas said. "Yes." Her jaw had the slight set it got when something had gotten under her composure. "I told him the fence was on my father's survey line, that I had the documents to prove it, and that if he'd like to dispute it, he was welcome to hire his own surveyor." "What did he say?" "He said a woman on her own in winter had enough to manage without making enemies of her neighbors." She paused. He said it in a tone that was meant to sound like friendly advice. Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the mare, then at Evelyn, then at the fence line visible in the middle distance. Straight, newly reinforced, going where the survey said it should go. "Is he going to be a problem?" he said. "He already is a problem," she said. "He's just trying to decide if I'm the kind of problem he wants to make bigger." She was quiet for a moment. "He thinks I'll get tired of fighting him." "Will you?" She turned and looked at him then, with the flat, direct expression she used when a question struck her as having an obvious answer. "No," she said. "Then he'll figure that out eventually," Silas said. "And until he does, the fence is there." She held his look for a moment. Something in her expression shifted. The jaw loosened slightly. The set of it became less rigid. "He made me feel—" She stopped. She started again. "He made me feel like someone who could be managed, like a temporary inconvenience that would resolve itself when the circumstances changed." She turned back to the fence. "I've been managing this property for 3 years. I know every fence post and every survey marker and every agreement my father made. And he stood on my porch and implied that I didn't know what I was doing because I'm a woman who lives alone." "You don't live alone," Silas said. She looked at him. He met her eyes. "You're here every week," he said. "Ben and Nora have been out twice this month. Ruth comes by. You're not alone." She looked at him for a long moment, in the specific way she had that made him feel like he was being read. Not intrusively, but carefully, with genuine attention. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not." Something settled between them in the afternoon quiet, in the particular stillness of the paddock, with the horse moving gently behind the fence and the light going golden at the edges. Silas reached into his jacket pocket. He hadn't planned it for this moment, or rather, he'd planned it for a moment, and this moment had arrived, and it seemed more real than anything he'd rehearsed, so he let the rehearsal go. "Evelyn," he said. She was still looking at him. She saw what was in his hand before he said anything else, and her expression did something complicated. A quick, unguarded movement across her face, there and then managed, though not quite fully. "That's—" she started. "My mother's," he said. "She wore it for 31 years. It's not much to look at. It's garnet, not anything." He stopped himself because he'd started apologizing for the ring, and that was the wrong thing. He steadied. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "not as something eventual or something we've been moving toward. I want to ask you directly, right now. Will you marry me, Evelyn?" She stood at the paddock fence with her arms still folded on the top rail and looked at him in the ring, and what crossed her face was not the composed, organized expression she typically showed the world, but the real one underneath. The one that was, in this moment, doing several things simultaneously and not entirely managing all of them. Her eyes went wet. She didn't cry. Evelyn was not a woman who cried easily, and she didn't cry now. But her eyes went wet and her jaw moved slightly, and she looked at the ring in his hand with the expression of someone receiving something they'd been waiting for and now weren't entirely sure what to do with. "That ring," she said, "was your mother's." "Yes." "She wore it for 31 years." "She did." "And you've had it for 4 years and you're giving it to me." "I'm asking," he said. "There's a difference." Something shifted in her expression. "Silas Mercer," she said, "if you've carried that ring out here every Saturday for more than a month and not said anything—" "2 weeks," he said. "3, maybe." She looked at him. "3 weeks," he confirmed. She shook her head slowly, with the expression that contained both exasperation and something that was definitively not exasperation. She unfolded her arms from the fence rail. She stood up straight and turned to face him fully, the way she did when she was about to say something she meant completely. "Yes," she said, simply, just that. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, steadier. "I'll marry you." He put the ring on her finger, which required a slight adjustment because it was made for a smaller hand than his mother's had been, and it went on a bit stiffly, and he said, "I can have it sized," and she said, "Leave it for now," and looked at it on her finger with an expression he couldn't quite describe and didn't try to. They stood at the paddock fence in the October afternoon, and the mare looked at them with her gentle, disinterested attention, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there wasn't anything that needed saying right then, and both of them understood that. He told Ben that evening, stopping by the Colby house on his way home. Ben's 2 boys were asleep, and Nora was at the table with some sewing, and Ben answered the door with the expression of a man who could read information in a person's face. He read it now. "Well," Ben said. "She said yes," Silas said. Ben looked at him for another moment, and then he did something he very rarely did, which was pull Silas into a brief, somewhat clumsy embrace. The kind men managed when they were feeling something real and didn't quite know what to do with it physically. Silas received it with the slight stiffness of someone equally unused to the gesture, and then they both stepped back and Ben cleared his throat. "Come in," he said. "I'll get the whiskey." Nora looked up from her sewing and read the situation immediately. "Evelyn?" she said. "Evelyn," Silas confirmed. Nora set down the sewing and stood and crossed the room and hugged him properly, which was less awkward than Ben's version because Nora had no self-consciousness about it. "It's about time," she said into his shoulder. "It is so far past time." "I know," he said. 3 years, she said. "I know. And then 3 more weeks with the ring in your pocket." "Ben told you that." "Ben tells me everything eventually." She stepped back and looked at him with the warm, direct assessment of a woman who had known him long enough to dispense with the social version of caring. "You look different," she said. "I'm the same," he said. "No," she said. "You look like something's been set down." He thought about that for a moment. He thought it was probably accurate. Ben poured 3 small glasses of whiskey, and they sat at the kitchen table, which was the table where most important things in the Colby household happened. And they talked for an hour about the logistics of it, what needed to be arranged, how long a courtship convention required before a wedding could be planned without raising eyebrows. Silas had not thought about most of these things yet, being still in the immediate reality of it, and Ben and Nora handled the practical considerations with the organized enthusiasm of people who enjoyed that kind of planning. "She'll want to keep the property," Nora said. "She'll want it in her name. You should be clear that it isn't going to become something you absorb." "It's her land," Silas said. "It was never going to be otherwise." Nora nodded, satisfied. "Good. Then tell her that explicitly. Don't leave it assumed." "Nora," Ben said mildly. "I'm just saying what she'll need to hear," Nora said. "Evelyn doesn't leave things to assumption. She'll want it said clearly." "She'll say it herself first," Silas said. "You know how she is." "I know how she is," Nora agreed. "That's how I know it needs to be said." He left around 9 and walked home through the October night, which was cold enough now to make his breath visible, the stars very clear in the way they got this time of year when the air was dry and the sky was fully dark. Main Street was quiet. The saloon had its light going, a low murmur of voices from inside. The stable was dark, the horses settled. He stood outside the stable door for a moment and looked at the street, the buildings, the sky above the ridge. He understood, been afraid for a long time. Afraid of the specific thing he'd wanted, which was a kind of fear he recognized now as the most foolish variety, the kind that used the very importance of something as a reason not to reach for it, as if things that mattered could only be protected by never risking them. He'd risked it. It hadn't cost him what he'd feared. It had cost him 3 years of not having it, which was its own kind of loss, but not an unrecoverable one. He went inside, checked the horses, made sure the water was full. He did this the same way he did it every night, with the same hands, in the same order. But the stable felt different tonight, though nothing in it had changed. It felt like a place with a future attached to it, which it had always had, but the future had been abstract before and was now specific in a way that altered the texture of the present. He went upstairs, took the lamp to his room, sat on the edge of his bed for a moment in the way a person sits when something significant has happened and they're not ready to sleep yet but don't have any particular activity to fill the time. He thought about Evelyn looking at the ring on her finger at the paddock fence, the unguarded expression, the one she'd almost managed to put away before it was fully visible, but not quite. He thought about 3 years of Saturday mornings, of coffee wrapped in cloth, of conversations that ended the way good things end. Not trailing off, but resting, in the assurance of continuation. He thought about his mother's ring on Evelyn's finger, worn smooth on the inside from decades of another hand, beginning now to belong to this one. He put the lamp out. Outside, the October wind moved through the valley, and the cottonwoods gave up a few more leaves, and the town of Blackridge Crossing settled into its ordinary dark, the kind that covered extraordinary things without knowing it, the way dark always does, indifferent and complete and temporary. The wedding was in November, 3 weeks before the first serious snow. It was not a large affair, which suited both of them. The church on the north end of Main Street, the bell working for once without sticking, the pews filled with the people who actually knew them rather than the people who simply knew of them. Ruth Caffey sat in the front row with the particular expression of someone who had earned the right to feel satisfied. Ben and Nora Colby were there with both boys, the younger one asleep against Nora's shoulder before the ceremony was half finished. Margaret Holt came and cried, which she did at weddings on principle and without apology. Even Ed Crane from the barbershop showed up, which Silas noted with private amusement, given the man's earlier editorial opinions on the subject. Evelyn wore a dress she and Ruth had made together through October, not white. White was impractical, and she was a practical woman, but a deep blue-green that Ruth had found the fabric for in a catalog from a Denver supplier, the color of creek water in late afternoon. She wore her hair up, simply, with no decoration she hadn't already owned. She carried nothing. She walked to the front of the church on her own, which she'd insisted on, because she was not property being transferred and she had no intention of performing as if she were. Silas was already there when she came down the aisle. He turned when he heard her, which was a little early, because he'd been listening for her, and when he turned she was looking at him with an expression that was not the composed, managed version of herself and never would be again in moments like this. It was the real one, slightly undone around the edges, the one that had been visible for a fraction of a second at the paddock fence in October, and was visible now for a longer, more deliberate moment. He thought she was the most real person he'd ever seen in his life. The ceremony was brief. The minister spoke. They spoke. The ring moved from his jacket pocket to its permanent position on her finger, sized now properly by the jeweler in Laramie who'd looked at the garnet setting with professional interest and said it was good old work. Whoever had made it had known what they were doing. When it was over, Ruth Caffey exhaled with a sound that was not quite a word, but contained the meaning of one. The reception was at the Harper Place, Mercer Place now, though nobody quite knew what to call it yet, and the sign situation was a conversation for later. And it had the warm, slightly chaotic quality of a gathering organized by people who were good at specific things and had divided those things sensibly. Nora Colby had managed the food, which was considerable. Ben had procured 2 barrels of decent cider from a supplier in Cheyenne. Ruth had decorated the front room with whatever the November land could provide, which was less than June would have offered, but more than people expected. The afternoon went long. People ate and talked, and the 2 Colby boys ran through the house with the specific energy of small children at adult events. And Evelyn sat at her own table in her own house and received her neighbors and was, for the first time in longer than she could precisely measure, simply happy. Not the defended version of happiness she'd practiced for 3 years, the careful kind that didn't commit too far forward, but the actual thing, which was messier and more fragile and more worth having. Silas, across the room, was talking to Ben with the relieved ease of a man who had spent the day in a degree of social exposure that was somewhat above his comfortable limit, and was very glad to be talking to someone he didn't have to perform for. He caught Evelyn's eye at one point. She was in the middle of a conversation with Margaret Holt about the vegetable operation, something practical, her natural ground, and she gave him a look that said, without words, "How are you holding up?" And he gave her one back that said, "Ask me in an hour." And she almost smiled and turned back to Margaret. Ruth watched this exchange from near the window and said nothing to anyone about it, which was the right call. But she held on to it with the private satisfaction of a woman who had seen what she'd needed to see. Callum Peters did not come to the wedding. He hadn't been invited, but his absence was noted by the people who knew about the fence line dispute, which was most of the town. The week after the wedding, Silas rode out to the Peters property on a Tuesday morning and spoke to Callum in the yard. He was not aggressive about it. That wasn't his way, and it wouldn't have served the purpose. He was direct. The survey was clear, the fence was where it belonged, and the person on the other side of it was now his wife and not someone who would be managing the situation alone. He said it without threat, but with the specific quality of a man who means exactly what he says and has nothing particular to prove, which is sometimes more effective than anger. Callum Peters looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. "I didn't have a quarrel with you," Callum said. "You had one with my wife," Silas said, "which is the same thing." Another long look. Callum was not a bad man, Silas had decided. He was an opportunistic one, which was different, and opportunistic men generally understood when an opportunity had closed. "The fence is fine where it is," Callum said, finally. "Good," Silas said. "Glad we understand each other." He rode back without incident. When he told Evelyn that evening, she listened with her arms folded and her head slightly tilted, the way she held herself when she was managing a response. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. I was handling it." "I know that too," he said. "You were handling it fine. He paused, trying to be accurate. "I wanted him to know that you have people. Not because you can't manage on your own, because you do have people, and that's true. And I thought it was worth him knowing." She looked at him for a moment. The folded arms loosened slightly. "That's different from doing it for me," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "All right," which was her version of thank you when the thing being thanked was complicated, and he understood that. And they went in to supper. The first winter of their marriage was not easy, and they never pretended it was. The cold came in hard in December, harder than the previous 2 years, and the stable required constant attention. Frozen water lines, horses that needed extra feeding, a roof section on the east side that had been marginal going into autumn and became a genuine problem by January. Silas worked brutal hours through January and February, coming home after dark most nights with the specific exhaustion of a man whose body had done more than it had. And Evelyn kept the farmstead running and managed the animals and cooked dinner and sometimes had it waiting and sometimes didn't, because she was exhausted too, and they'd both agreed early on that the performance of domesticity was less important than the reality of two people making something work together. There were nights he was too tired to talk, which she'd been warned about and had still found harder to navigate than she'd expected. Not the quiet itself, she'd always understood the quiet, but the particular version of it that came with exhaustion, which was harder to read than his natural silence, which had its own texture. There were nights she over-explained something she was worried about until he'd said, gently but clearly, "Evelyn, you lost me at the second fence." And she'd stopped and laughed despite herself, and they'd gone to bed without resolving the thing, which turned out to be fine, because most things look different in the morning. In February, the roof section came down in a night storm, taking part of the east wall with it. Silas stood in the stable at 4 a.m, looking at the damage with a lamp in his hand, and the horses crowded into the western stalls and the wind coming through where the wall had been. And what he felt was not panic, but the flat, heavy weight of a setback that was going to cost more than he had immediately available. He told Evelyn at breakfast. She listened without interrupting, which she was better at when the information was bad than when she was anxious. And then she said, "How much?" He told her his estimate. She was quiet for a moment, doing arithmetic he couldn't see. "I have the summer's earnings set aside," she said. "It's not what you need all of it, but it covers most." "That's your money," he said. "That's the farm's money." "We're married," she said. "That doesn't mean—" "Silas." She looked at him with the direct, patient expression she used when she thought he was being unnecessarily principled in a way that was making a practical problem worse. The farm needs the stable to be functioning as much as the stable needs to stand up. If your horses are crowded into half the space, you lose clients and we lose income, and the farm suffers for it too. She paused. "This is not a favor. This is just math." He looked at her. He wanted to argue further, and he didn't, because she was right and he knew it. And one of the things he'd learned about Evelyn in the months they'd been married was that when she was right, she was usually also done discussing it. "I'll pay it back," he said. "Into our account," she said. "Yes." They fixed the roof in March, when the weather broke enough to work, with Ben Colby's help and 2 men Silas hired for the week. It took longer than expected and cost slightly more than estimated, which was the nature of repairs. By April, the stable was whole again. The clients who'd taken their horses elsewhere during the disruption had mostly returned, and the spring brought new business from 2 ranches that hadn't used him before. He told Evelyn about it on a Saturday evening, sitting on the porch where they developed the habit of sitting after supper when the weather allowed. She received it with the satisfaction of someone who had calculated correctly. "The Hendricks account is good business," she said, meaning one of the new ranches. "Henry Hendricks doesn't spend money without thinking about it. He said his foreman recommended us." "Did he say which foreman?" "Dawson, I think." She nodded. "Dawson's wife is Clara Finch's cousin. Clara talks to me sometimes. Apparently she mentioned you." She paused. "In a positive way." Silas looked at her. "You've been—" "I haven't done anything," she said. "Clara talks to me. I can't stop her talking to me." He looked at her for another moment with the expression that meant he understood perfectly well what had happened and was choosing not to make it into a conversation. "Thank you," he said. "You fixed the fence," she said. 3 times. Us. The children came with the ordinary improbability of children, not planned with precision, not a surprise exactly, just life moving forward the way it does when people stop being afraid of it. A daughter first, born in the autumn of 1886, whom they named Clara, after the neighbor who talked too much and meant well, which Evelyn felt was a sufficient tribute. Clara was a serious child from the beginning, dark-haired like Silas, with Evelyn's way of looking at things carefully before responding. She was the kind of child who watched a new situation from the edges before deciding to enter it, which made her harder to worry about but easier to underestimate. And both her parents were alert to the second danger. A son 2 years later, named Douglas for Evelyn's father, who arrived in the world with considerable noise and opinion and maintained both as defining characteristics into childhood. He was easier in some ways and more exhausting in others. The kind of child who loved with his whole self and fought with his whole self and couldn't seem to moderate the volume of either. He had Silas's hands, broad and capable, and Evelyn's tongue, which was sometimes a difficult combination and never a dull one. The house expanded. Not dramatically. They added a room in 1887, a practical operation that Silas designed and Ben helped build, intended for whatever arrived and useful in the meantime for storage. The stable grew too, slowly, through reinvestment and a good run of years and the steady reputation that builds when you do one thing consistently and don't cut corners on it. The farm adapted as Evelyn found what it did best, which turned out to be not the vegetable operation she'd started with, but a combination of it and a small dairy operation she'd begun almost by accident when a neighbor needed to offload 2 good milk cows, and she'd taken them provisionally and then discovered there was reliable demand in town she hadn't anticipated. None of it was fast. None of it was simple. There were years that were harder than others, a drought in 1889 that made the summer brutal for everyone in the valley, a winter in 1891 that came early and mean and cost them 2 of the farm's animals and 1 of the stable's long-term horses. There were disagreements that lasted longer than a night, real ones, about money and about how much help to hire and about whether to expand the stable into a second location in the next town, which Silas eventually decided against and Evelyn thought was the wrong call, but accepted because it was his business and she understood the difference between her opinion and her authority. She told Ruth about the disagreement on one of Ruth's visits, with the frank specificity that characterized how Evelyn discussed her marriage to the one person she discussed it with. "He's not wrong," Evelyn said. "Expanding into an unknown market with capital we'd have to borrow is genuinely risky. I know that." "But," Ruth said, "but I think he's being careful in the way he sometimes is when what's actually happening is that he's afraid." She paused. "And I can't tell him that, because he'll think I'm saying his judgment is wrong, and it isn't wrong, it's just colored." Ruth considered it. "Have you tried saying exactly that?" "How?" "That you think the risk is real and you understand why he's cautious, and that you also wonder if the caution is partly fear and whether that's worth looking at." Ruth shrugged slightly. "He's been honest with you about his fear before. He might be again." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "He said, Evelyn, you lost me at the second fence last week," she said, instead of responding to what Ruth had suggested. "About something completely different." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Did you lose him?" "Yes," Evelyn admitted. "I'd been talking for about 15 minutes about the dairy accounts, and I'd stopped talking about the accounts and started talking about a conversation I'd had with Agnes Whitfield that led to something else. And Yes, he was right." "Did you appreciate him saying it?" A pause. "I appreciated it more than I appreciated needing it said." Ruth smiled at her with the specific warmth of a woman who had known her for nearly 30 years and found her, despite everything, consistently surprising. The autumn of 1893 was when Clara, at 7 years old, asked her mother the question. She asked it in the kitchen, while Evelyn was at the stove and Douglas was outside with his father doing something involving a great deal of noise and at least one thing falling over. Clara was at the table with a piece of paper, drawing something she'd been working on for an hour, with the focused intensity she brought to projects that mattered to her. "Mama," she said, without looking up from the paper. Evelyn said. "How did you know to marry Papa?" Evelyn kept her hands on what she was doing. She did not, as she might once have done, produce the quick, organized answer she had ready for difficult questions. She let the question sit for a moment, the way it deserved. "I didn't at first," she said. "I knew I wanted to. But knowing you want something and knowing it's the right thing aren't always the same." Clara looked up from her drawing. "How did you find out it was right?" Evelyn looked at her daughter. The serious dark eyes, the familiar set of her face when she was genuinely trying to understand something. "I stopped being afraid of it," she said. "I'd been afraid for a long time. Not of your father, of being wrong, of wanting something that wasn't going to work out." She paused. "And then one day I stopped being afraid and I found out it was going to work out, not because it was perfect, but because we were both going to keep trying." Clara thought about this with the thoroughness she gave things. "Papa was afraid too," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Your father was afraid longer than I was," Evelyn said. "And then he stopped." "What made him stop?" "Someone told him to." She paused. "And the right moment." Clara seemed to find this satisfactory. She went back to her drawing. Evelyn stood at the stove and looked at her daughter's bent head, the careful way her hand moved across the paper, and she thought about a Tuesday night in July, 9 years ago. A man standing at her door with his hat in his hands and his fear on his face, and the truth finally making it out of him after 3 years of waiting. She thought about the paddock fence in October and a small ring worn smooth from someone else's 31 years. She thought about a roof coming down in February, and dinner that wasn't always ready, and the second fence, and a man who went quiet sometimes for no reason anyone else could see. She thought about what she'd told Ruth the previous year. "I think he's being careful in the way he sometimes is when what's actually happening is that he's afraid." And she thought about how she'd finally said that to him, directly, one evening on the porch, with the children inside and the night coming in over the ridge, and how he'd been quiet for a long time and then said, "You might be right," and how those 3 words had been more significant than anything elaborate would have been. The second stable location had opened in 1892. It was doing well. Outside, Douglas shouted something triumphant, and Silas's voice came back. Lower, steadier, the specific tone he used with his son that managed to be both patient and firm, which Evelyn had noticed was something he'd had to learn, because patience with children was not the same as patience with horses, and the learning had not been without incident. He was not a perfect father. He was too quiet sometimes in ways the boy found frustrating, too slow to praise in the ways Douglas needed praised, too inclined toward the doing of things rather than the talking about them. These were things Evelyn sometimes had to translate. She had become, without particularly planning to, the person who explained Silas to their children and the children to Silas, which was its own kind of work and not something she resented, but something she was clear-eyed about. She did not resent it because she understood what it was, the ordinary, unromantic work of two people who were genuinely different from each other deciding to stay in the same place. That was what a marriage was, in her experience. Not a resolution of differences, but a daily, sometimes grinding negotiation with them. Not a story that ended, but a practice that continued. She had not gotten what she'd imagined when she'd been 21, and first understood that she wanted Silas Mercer. What she'd imagined had been simpler, cleaner, more like a destination than a direction. What she'd actually gotten was harder and more specific and, on most days, in most ways, considerably better. The door opened and Douglas came in first, red-faced and pleased with himself, followed by Silas, who had wood shavings on his jacket and was carrying something wrapped in cloth that turned out to be a repaired hinge from the barn door. "Fixed it," Douglas announced, with the enthusiasm of a child who has contributed to a task and is unclear on the proportion of his contribution. "I can see that," Evelyn said. She looked at Silas over her son's head. He looked back at her with the slight expression that said, "He helped for about 8 minutes and then supervised for an hour." She turned back to the stove. "Dinner's almost ready," she said. "Both of you wash your hands. Clara, set the table." Clara set down her drawing without complaint. Douglas went to the basin. Silas put the hinge on the shelf by the door, where it would stay until he found the right moment to install it, which, knowing him, was probably Sunday, and shrugged off his jacket and washed his hands after his son. The kitchen filled with the sounds and smells of an ordinary evening, which was all it was, and which was everything. Later, after the children were in bed and the house had gone quiet, they sat on the porch in the manner they'd made into a habit, in the chairs that had their chairs now from years of use, with the darkness settled full over the valley and the stars doing what stars did over Wyoming in autumn, which was everything they could, with no competition from anything below. Evelyn had her hands folded in her lap. The garnet ring caught the faint light, the way it sometimes did. Silas was quiet beside her, the natural kind, the kind she'd learned to read. "You were right about the second location," she said, not as a point scored, just as a thing true enough to finally say directly. He turned to look at her slightly. "You were right," she said again, "about the risk being real. I pushed, and I don't think I was wrong to push, but you were right about the risk." He looked at the dark valley for a moment. "It worked out," he said. "It worked out because you planned it carefully," she said, "not because I was right." He was quiet for another moment. Then, "You were right that I was afraid." "I know." "I don't always know when I am," he said. "It doesn't feel like fear from the inside. It feels like caution." "I know that too," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. In the darkness, with the stars above the ridge and the valley below them, and the house behind them full of the breathing quiet of two sleeping children. "Are you happy?" he asked. He didn't ask it often. When he did, he meant it as a real question, not a ritual one. She thought about it, the way she thought about things that deserved actual thought rather than automatic response. "Most of the time," she said, "the real kind of happy, not the easy kind." He nodded. He looked back at the valley. "Me too," he said. The night settled around them. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, which had gone bare now, the last of the October leaves finished. A coyote called somewhere on the far ridge, a single note, and went quiet. They sat there for a while longer without talking, because they'd both long since learned that the quiet between them was not absence but presence. The particular presence of two people who had stopped needing to fill every space, who trusted the silence the way you only trust things you've tested. Eventually, Evelyn said she was going in. Silas said he'd be in shortly. She put her hand on his shoulder for a moment, briefly, as she passed. Not a gesture that announced itself, just a contact, simple and specific, and went inside. He sat alone for another 10 minutes. He was not a man who thought in grand terms about his life, who stood back and assessed it against some larger measure. He didn't do that. What he did was notice, in the particular and the immediate, the hinge on the shelf, the horse that had been off its feed and was better now, the sound of his son's voice when he was pleased with himself, the way his daughter drew things with the total attention of someone who believed the drawing mattered, the way a hand rested on his shoulder for a moment, in passing, in the dark. He'd been afraid for a long time of something that turned out to be available to him. He understood that now with the plain, unadorned clarity of years. He didn't dwell on the fear or congratulate himself for overcoming it. What he thought, on the rare occasions he thought about it directly, was simply, I nearly didn't. And then, because he was the kind of man he was, he went inside.
I tried, Ben. Damn, never mind, your poison is fucking insane. Yeah. Let me play that on the next run. New Forza game comes out soon. People play those? Sorry.
He's about to die. I think he's just dead. He's dead. Unless you want to kill him, just...
Yeah, I wasn't gonna let you have your moment. Gain 1 strength and 1 dexterity. Nah, these all kind of suck.
Turn off shared chat. What?
Rimbo's not being nice. Subnautica 2 came out today. Really? I heard it was really hard to run for people who have shitty ass computers. Is that true?
He heard somewhere.
I heard that somewhere. Is that true?
Protaita.
Protaita! Oh, dude, if only I had fucking $9 more, I'd be able to get the membership card. I fucking
to you.
hate my life, man. Oh, that would be so good.
What if you're below the height of 5'6", it doesn't run your computer? James is like 5'9"?
Yeah, I'm 5'9". Chandler, I heard you're a bitch. Sorry. That one wasn't even clever. I was just mad. That's my bad. Oh, this is fire. I need this.
Immediately said sorry.
I'm lucky. That's accurate, but I'm a 6'1" bitch. Holy Heimog. Holy Heimog. Somebody kill this guy. Sorry, I didn't mean that.
Yes, you did.
I did.